walked into a pharmacy for her medicine. Minutes later, she was handcuffed like a criminal, humiliated in front of strangers. But what those officers didn't know, she wasn't alone, and tonight, her father's shadow would stretch from Washington, D.C., straight into their precinct, with a storm they'll never escape. Before we continue this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another powerful story you won't want to miss. The hospital corridors stretched endlessly before Gloria Tate as she made her way toward the exit, each step heavy with exhaustion. 16 hours. 16 relentless hours spent patching up broken bodies, calming terrified families, and working through the storm of chaos that defined the ER. Her shift badge swung limply from her scrubs, damp from sweat and the weight of a day that refused to end. Behind her, the nurses' station hummed with low voices, and the shuffle of paperwork. Some staff were finishing charts, others gathering their things for the journey home. Cheryl, one of her fellow nurses, called after her, voice tinged with concern and familiarity. "Don't forget your BP meds, Gloria. You take care of everyone else. Start taking care of yourself, too." The words came with a tired laugh, one only healthcare workers could share after a long shift. Gloria managed a weary smile, warmed by the reminder but unable to shake. She paused for a moment at the staff exit, glancing back at the hospital that had been her battle foil for 3 decades. She had seen it all in these halls: heartbreak, hope, and everything in between. She had walked grieving mothers to empty waiting rooms and held the trembling hands of dying strangers. She had been the steady voice in emergencies when no one else could think straight. But beneath that resilience lived a quiet wariness, the price of giving so much of yourself to a world that rarely gave back. The air outside wrapped around her like a wet blanket. Even though the sun had long disappeared, the Georgia heat clung to the streets, thick and sticky. She slid into her weathered sedan, the seat creaking beneath her as she exhaled a slow, measured breath. She wasn't thinking of trouble. She wasn't thinking of headlines or viral videos. All she wanted was to pick up her prescription, drive home, and fall into bed before her alarm reminded her it would all start again tomorrow. But fate had a different plan. The pharmacy sat on the corner of a sleepy strip mall, its sickly yellow lights bleeding onto the cracked pavement like a tired beacon. The surrounding storefronts had long gone dark, leaving the pharmacy a lone island of artificial brightness in the quiet night. Gloria parked beneath a flickering street lamp, the only one still alive in the lot, its pulse matching her tired heartbeat. She gathered her purse, checked her ID and insurance card, and stepped into the thick summer air, unaware of the storm she was walking into. Inside the pharmacy, the world felt smaller, harsher. A teenage clerk, face lit blue by the glow of his phone, barely lifted his eyes when the bell above the door chimed weakly. Gloria approached with a familiar smile, the kind she wore every day to soften tired strangers. "Evening, sweetheart. Just here for my refill." Her voice carried the warmth of someone used to calming nerves, even when her own were frayed. She slid her prescription slip, ID and insurance card across the counter, routine and simple. The boy took them without much thought, fingers fumbling over the keyboard as he peered at the computer screen. For a moment everything was ordinary, mundane, but ordinary wouldn't last. Not tonight. The teenager behind the counter frowned, his brow furrowing as the computer screen filled with error messages he didn't understand. Gloria watched him shift awkwardly in his seat, glancing toward the back office with hesitation. It was a small moment, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention, but Gloria had spent a lifetime reading the subtle shifts in people's faces, the quiet moments when fear or suspicion slipped past politeness. She saw it now, settling across the boy's shoulders like a heavy coat. He whispered toward the back, voice low and uneasy. A moment later, the pharmacy manager emerged, a white woman in her 40s, with sharp features and a tightly pulled ponytail. She wore an expression that was equal parts authority and disdain. Even before she spoke, Glory could feel the shift in the air, that familiar, suffocating weight, the kind that said, without words, "You don't belong here." The manager approached the counter with the brittle smile of someone masking hostility beneath customer service pleasantries. "Good evening, ma'am," she said, her voice tight with forced courtesy. I'm afraid there's an issue with your prescription. Gloria kept her expression calm, steady. I've filled this prescription here for years. What kind of issue? The woman tapped the monitor, her nails clicking against the plastic frame. Your insurance information doesn't match our system tonight. I'm afraid we can't process this transaction. A long pause hung between them, heavy and charged. Gloria leaned slightly forward, her voice low but firm. Everything you need is right there. My ID, my insurance card. Please check again. But the manager was already withdrawing, her mind made up before Gloria ever spoke. I've double-checked. The system flagged it as suspicious. We've contacted the authorities for verification. For a moment, the words didn't register. Gloria blinked, as if trying to clear a fog from her mind. The authorities? She repeated, her voice sharp but measured. You called the police? The teenage clerk winced and looked away, suddenly fascinated by the stain on the counter. The manager's smile thinned into something colder. It's our policy in cases of suspected fraud, for everyone's safety. There it was, wrapped in false concern and polished language. The ugly, old suspicion. Gloria felt it settle on her shoulders like an old enemy returned. She could feel her heart thudding in her chest, not from fear, but from the exhausting familiarity of it all. After all the lives she'd saved, after all the years spent helping others, without question, this is what the world saw when it looked at her. A threat, a suspect. Not a nurse, not a healer, just a black woman standing alone at a counter, asking for her medication. She inhaled slowly, grounding herself in the moment. She could walk away. She could take her ID, her prescription slip, and leave, but she knew what that would look like in the report. Suspect fled scene before verification. No, she wouldn't give them that story. I'll wait right here, Gloria said, her voice clear and unwavering, because I've done nothing wrong. The manager's expression flickered, something between surprise and irritation, but she said nothing more. She simply crossed her arms and retreated a few steps, watching Gloria like she might bolt at any second. And somewhere in the distance, faint but growing louder, sirens began to wail, cutting through the humid Georgia night like a warning bell. The sirens grew louder, splitting the quiet Georgia night like a jagged crack down the center of calm. Gloria stood still, her hands resting lightly on the counter, heart pounding, but her face unreadable. The boy behind the register fidgeted with the scanner, stealing quick, nervous glances at her, like he wished the floor would swallow him whole. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He knew. They all knew, in that cold, silent way that people know when something wrong is happening, but they're too scared to stop it. Outside, red and blue lights flashed against the pharmacy windows, painting the walls in harsh, unforgiving streaks. The squad car doors slammed shut, a brutal punctuation mark against the soft hum of the night. The officers were here, and the story that had begun with a tired nurse and a simple prescription was about to spin far beyond the truth. Gloria took one last deep breath, steadying herself. Her exhaustion was still there, heavy and aching in her bones, but something colder burned underneath now. A quiet fury, the kind born not from surprise, but from recognition. She'd seen this story before, lived it in 100 small ways across her life. Tonight, it just had a louder siren. The pharmacy doors swung open with a sharp chime, and 2 officers stepped inside, both white, both wearing the practiced scowls of men who expected the world to step aside when they walked into a room. The first was tall and broad, with a buzz cut and a sneer already curling at his mouth like he'd solved the case before it even began. The second officer was thinner, younger, hanging back slightly as if still deciding how much of this he wanted to own. The manager rushed forward, her voice dropping into a fast, eager whisper. "That's her," she hissed, pointing toward Gloria. "Tried to pick up medication, fraudulently. The account didn't match. I think she's using stolen insurance information." The first officer didn't even glance at the computer screen. He didn't ask to see her ID or verify the prescription. He squared his shoulders, taking a slow, deliberate step toward Gloria, like a predator circling a tired animal. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "I'm going to need you to step outside." Gloria didn't move. "I haven't done anything wrong." The second officer shifted on his feet, uncertainty flickering across his face, but he said nothing. The manager folded her arms, her lips twitching with quiet satisfaction. The decision had already been made before Gloria ever spoke. Her words were background noise in a play where the ending had already been written. The first officer's hand rested on his belt. A subtle threat, but a threat nonetheless. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh glare across the pharmacy floor. Other customers paused at the end of the aisles, their eyes wide, their phones sliding silently from their pockets. And in that suspended moment, with the sirens still echoing faintly in the distance, Gloria knew this night was no longer about a prescription refill. It was about something much bigger and far more dangerous. The glass doors swung open with a sharp mechanical chime, slicing through the uneasy quiet of the pharmacy. And just like that, they entered, two white officers, the kind who wore their authority like armor, expecting submission before they spoke a word. Officer Rick Coleman led the way, tall, square-shouldered, a face hardened by years of unchecked power. His jaw clenched tight, as if the act of stepping into the room was a performance he'd done 100 times before. Right behind him came Officer David Miller, younger, thinner, his steps less certain, his gaze darting briefly across the room before lowering, as if already questioning what they were about to do. Coleman didn't ask for introductions. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't even glance at the computer screen where Gloria's valid prescription sat unprocessed. To him, the accusation was enough. The suspicion was fact, and Gloria, standing there, wary, steady, but still wrapped in quiet dignity, fit the picture he had already drawn in his mind. The pharmacy manager, still hovering behind the counter, stepped forward with artificial urgency. "That's her," she hissed, pointing as if identifying a fugitive. "She tried to use someone else's insurance. The accounts don't match. We called you to verify." Coleman barely acknowledged the explanation, his eyes locked on Gloria's, cold and unyielding. "Ma'am," he began, his voice low and commanding, "I'm going to need you to step outside with us. Now." Gloria didn't move. She had spent years steadying frightened patients in the middle of trauma, had faced panicked families, dying children, and impossible odds. This was intimidation, pure and simple, and she wouldn't give them what they wanted. Calmly, without raising her voice, she spoke. "I have my ID. I have my insurance card. My prescription is valid. Look at the documents before you make a mistake." Coleman's lips curled in something between a smirk and a sneer. "Relaxor that out at the station. Let's go." Miller shifted beside him, unease flickering across his features like a shadow. He glanced toward the computer screen, hesitated, but ultimately said nothing. Silence was easier than courage, safer. The pharmacy manager crossed her arms, her mouth tight with smug satisfaction. To her, this was over. She had seen what she wanted to see, and now she waited for the scene to play out the way it always did. Gloria stood her ground, heart pounding but face serene. "You're arresting me without verifying anything? Without checking my documents?" Coleman took a step closer, his boots heavy against the tile floor. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he warned. But Gloria's voice remained steady. "Harder for who?" The question hung in the air, sharp as a blade. Around them, the store had grown still. A mother near the cold medicine aisle clutched her child's hand and backed away. A man near the greeting cards watched with wide eyes, his phone raised discreetly, recording. The tension crackled like static. This wasn't just about a prescription anymore. It was about power, about whether truth could survive when a badge decided it wasn't enough. And in that moment, Gloria knew exactly what she was facing. Coleman's hand hovered near his belt, fingers tapping the radio. as if daring Gloria to resist. He didn't need evidence. He didn't want the truth. What he wanted was compliance. Blind and immediate. Power didn't ask. It took. Gloria could feel the heat rising behind her ears, that bitter, familiar sting of being criminalized without cause. But she forced herself to remain calm. She had lived through too many nights where panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Slowly, with deliberate care, she lifted her purse and removed her ID and insurance card, holding them out in plain sight. "Look," she said, her voice level but firm, "everything matches. My name is Gloria Tate. I've been filling this prescription here for years. There's no fraud, just a system that thinks suspicion is proof when my skin is the wrong color." Miller shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his uncertainty now impossible to hide. He glanced sideways at Coleman, but Coleman's face remained a mask of cold resolve. "Step outside," Coleman repeated, his voice louder now, cutting through the quiet pharmacy like a blade. "Last chance." For a moment, time seemed to stretch thin. Gloria looked past him to the faces frozen in the aisles. The teenage clerk, his thumb hovering over his phone screen, the elderly man gripping his cane with white knuckles, the young woman by the greeting cards, watching through wide, horrified eyes. People who had seen this play out before, too many times. And Gloria made her choice. "Annie," she said softly, but it rang out like thunder. "Not until you do your job and check my documents." Coleman's face darkened. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them. His hand shot out and clamped roughly around her wrist, yanking it downward. Gasps rippled through the store. Phones came up, recording in shaky hands. Somewhere a voice whispered, "Oh my God," but no one moved to stop him. The metal handcuffs snapped cold against Gloria's wrists, biting into the tender skin already raw from exhaustion. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry out. She met Coleman's sneer with steady, unflinching eyes. Miller stood back, arms crossed tightly, his mouth pressed into a thin line. He looked like a man who knew this wasn't right, but lacked the spine to change it. As Coleman finished securing the cuffs, he leaned in, his voice low and sharp. "Now we'll sort it out downtown." Gloria, her hands bound, raised her chin slightly, her voice steady, quiet enough that only he could hear it. "You're going to regret this." The words hung in the air, cold and certain, a warning rather than a threat. But Coleman laughed, a short, harsh sound. He gave her arm a rough tug and turned toward the door. Behind them, the store remained frozen in stunned silence. The customers, the clerk, the manager, they all watched as Gloria Tate, a woman who had spent her life healing others, was dragged away like a common criminal. But the cameras were still rolling. The truth had witnesses now. And it wasn't going to stay buried. The night air hit Gloria like a wall, thick and humid, clinging to her skin as Officer Coleman marched her through the sliding doors. The pharmacy's artificial light gave way to the harsh glow of the parking lot's single flickering street lamp, casting fractured shadows on the cracked pavement. Each step echoed in the stillness, loud and jarring, as if the world was holding its breath. Behind them, the glass doors slowly slid shut, muffling the stunned whispers and gasps of the onlookers still watching from inside. The teenage clerk stood frozen behind the counter, phone still in his hand, his recording light blinking like a quiet witness to injustice. Gloria's wrists throbbed with each step, the steel cuffs biting deeper into her skin, but she held her head high. She refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She wasn't a suspect. She wasn't a thief. She was a woman who had done everything right and still found herself shackled by someone else's prejudice. The squad car sat waiting beneath the streetlight, its roof lights still flashing faintly, though no siren pierced the night. Coleman opened the rear door with a sharp, impatient yank and gestured for her to get in. But before she slid into the car, Gloria paused. Just for a moment, she turned her head, locking eyes with the pharmacy manager, who had stepped outside to watch. arms folded smugly across her chest. That same brittle smile was still there, the smile of someone who thought they had won. And in that pause, Gloria spoke, calm, unwavering, and clear enough that it carried across the empty parking lot. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." For a split second, the manager's smile faltered. For a heartbeat, the confidence in Coleman's stance cracked, but only for a moment. Coleman scoffed and shoved her gently toward the open car door. "We'll see about that," he muttered, dismissive, and blind to what he'd just ignited. Gloria slid into the back seat, the door slamming shut behind her with a hollow finality. The car smelled of sweat, vinyl, and power misused. The windows were tinted, casting the outside world in shadows. As the squad car pulled away from the pharmacy, its headlights cut a path through the night, leaving the flickering street lamp and the silent witnesses behind. But the story didn't stay in that parking lot. Not anymore. Inside the pharmacy, the clerk finally lowered his phone, his hands trembling slightly as he stopped the recording. Customers exchanged uneasy glances, murmurs of disbelief filling the aisles. The footage would spread, as all truths eventually do. First to a friend, then to a local feed, and then beyond. The lie was already unraveling, frame by frame. And Gloria, shackled and silent in the back seat of that police car, stared straight ahead into the darkness, her heart pounding not with fear, but with resolve. Because this wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. The squad car rolled through the quiet streets of Savannah, its sirens off, but its lights still flashing, casting eerie red and blue shadows over the sleeping city. Inside the back seat, Gloria sat upright, her wrists burning from the tightness of the handcuffs, her breathing steady but slow. The air was thick with the smell of old vinyl seats and the faint scent of sweat and authority. Officer Coleman in the driver's seat exchanged casual remarks with Officer Miller, as if Gloria weren't there. They spoke in low, lazy voices, laughing about their shift and complaining about paperwork. At one point, Coleman chuckled, "Just another fraud case. People think they can take whatever they want." Miller said nothing in response, only staring ahead with a furrowed brow. Gloria heard every word, each syllable a sharp reminder of how quickly they had judged her, how little they cared to know the truth. The car turned sharply, jolting Gloria against the door. She didn't flinch. Every second in that car, she reminded herself who she was, Gloria Tate, a nurse, a daughter, a woman who had spent her life saving others, not the criminal they were trying to paint her as. She replayed the moment in the pharmacy in her mind, the manager's sneer, the click of the cuffs, the flash of camera phones. This story wasn't ending in a not tonight. They pulled into the precinct's cracked parking lot, a squat, tired building whose yellowed lights buzzed against the darkness. Coleman yanked open the door and jerked his chin. "Let's go." Gloria stepped out, standing tall despite the ache in her body. Officers loitering near the entrance glanced up, curiosity flickering across their faces. Some sipped coffee. Others scrolled their phones, but all watched as she was marched inside, another case to process. The booking desk smelled of stale coffee and bleach. A balding sergeant looked up, eyes narrowing. "Name?" "Gloria Tate," Coleman answered before she could speak, dropping her identity onto the cold linoleum like loose change. "Prescription fraud. Caught red-handed." The sergeant grunted and typed into an ancient computer. Gloria stood silently, her dignity wrapped around her like armor. She had nothing to hide, but everything to defend. Coleman smirked as he turned away, leaving her standing there. Officer Miller hesitated, his mouth opening slightly as if to say something, but the moment passed, and he followed Coleman into the shadows of the hallway. The sergeant sighed, grabbing the fingerprint kit. "Hands," he barked. Gloria complied, her wrists raw and red, as he rolled each finger onto the ink pad, then onto the cold white paper. Flash! The mugshot camera's bright light exploded in her face. For a brief moment she closed her eyes, shutting out the humiliation, the indignity. She would not let them define her by this moment. The sergeant gestured toward a steel door. "Holding cell." She walked through, each step echoing against the scuffed floors. The door clanged shut behind her with a metallic finality, sealing her into the harsh Florence and concrete walls of the holding cell. But even in that cold, hollow space, Gloria stood tall, because she knew the storm was already moving, and it was heading straight for them. The holding cell was frigid, the kind of cold that seeped through your skin and settled deep in your bones. Gloria sat on the narrow metal bench, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. The concrete walls reflected the harsh fluorescent lights above, casting shadows that danced with every flicker. She took slow, measured breaths, grounding herself against the chill and the deafening quiet. Time stretched and warped in the stillness. There was no clock, no windows, no way to mark the passing minutes. Just the steady hum of machinery and the occasional burst of laughter from the officers beyond the heavy steel door. Each laugh, muffled but sharp, reminded her that out there they still thought they held all the power. But they didn't. Not for long. Gloria's mind wandered briefly to her father, Walter Tate. She could picture him at home, seated at his old oak desk, flipping through case files, always methodical, always sharp. He was probably halfway through his first cup of strong black coffee when the call came in. She could almost hear the measured click of his pen as he took down every detail, his quiet fury simmering beneath the surface. Walter wasn't a man to let things lie, especially not when it came to his daughter. But it wasn't just Walter. Gloria knew the power of community, the power of eyes that refused to look away, the cell phone cameras that had caught her arrest, the witnesses at the pharmacy, the friends and colleagues who would be calling the station before the hour was out. They were all part of the storm already building outside these walls. Still, the weight of the night pressed down on her shoulders. Memories surfaced unbidden, the years of quiet racism she'd endured, the patients who had doubted her skills because of her skin, the times she'd spoken up only to be dismissed. This wasn't new. It was just louder tonight, and colder. She shifted on the bench, wincing as her wrists throbbed against the memory of the cuffs. Every ache, every sting, was another reason to fight harder, another reason not to break. The quiet was shattered by the sharp ring of a telephone, distant but unmistakable. Gloria's head lifted slightly, listening as the front desk sergeant picked up the call. The murmur of voices followed, too low to catch the words but clear enough to feel the tension. A beat, then a second, longer pause, and then footsteps, quick, clipped, purposeful. The steel door remained closed, but the energy in the building shifted. Gloria felt it in her bones. Something was happening. Something big enough to make them hesitate. Big enough to remind them they weren't as untouchable as they thought. She closed her eyes briefly, gathering strength. This wasn't over. Not yet. The first cracks were forming, and soon the entire facade would crumble. All she had to do was wait, and when the moment came, stand tall. Because the storm her father was about to unleash wasn't just for her. It was for every person who had ever been silenced, shoved aside, or wrongfully caged behind cold steel bars. Outside the cell, the footsteps grew louder. Sharp voices exchanged tense words in the hallway. Gloria kept her back straight and her head high, even as fatigue pulled at the edges of her mind. She knew how they wanted her to feel, powerless, forgotten, but what they didn't realize was that Gloria Tate had spent a lifetime learning how to endure, how to stand firm when the world tried to bend her. The steel door remained closed, but the walls seemed to pulse with the weight of what was unfolding beyond them. She could almost see Officer Coleman swaggering around the booking desk, pretending not to care but stealing nervous glances at the ringing phones. She imagined the desk sergeant wiping sweat from his brow as the voice on the other end of the line refused to be dismissed. Somewhere out there, her father's voice was cutting through the noise, cold and precise, like a scalpel slicing through layers of arrogance. Another phone rang, this one sharper, more urgent. Then came a voice, steady, firm, and unmistakably federal. "This is Special Agent Ramirez with the Department of Justice. Put your sergeant on the phone, now." The words cut through the static of the precinct like a blade. Gloria couldn't hear the response, but she felt it. The shift, the crack of fear slipping into their bravado. Inside the cell, she allowed herself a small, bitter smile. They thought they could erase her with a charge sheet and a cold bench. They thought they could box her in and control the narrative. But they didn't realize who they were dealing with. Walter Tate wasn't just any father. He was a retired FBI legend whose name still carried weight in federal circles. And once he was involved, this wasn't going to be swept quietly under the rug. Footsteps approached the cell door, this time slower, more hesitant. Gloria straightened. The door remained shut, but through the narrow viewing window, she saw Officer Miller glance in. His face was pale, tight with something close to guilt. For a moment their eyes met. He looked away. She heard his voice muffled through the door. Sergeant, we've got a problem. Someone from DC is on the line again. Says they're not hanging up until they speak to the lieutenant." A long pause. Then a harsh curse from deeper in the precinct. Another voice barked orders, sharp and clipped. Papers shuffled. Chairs scraped across the floor. The thin veneer of control was cracking faster now. Gloria leaned back against the cold wall, the hard bench pressing into her spine. She let the quiet fill the space again. But this time, it wasn't the silence of defeat. It was the silence before a storm breaks. Because soon enough, the door would open, and they would realize the mistake they had made wasn't just legal, it was personal. And the man on the other end of that phone wasn't going to stop until every single person who touched this injustice was held accountable. The waiting was nearly over. The precinct door swung open with a force that silenced the room. Conversations died mid-sentence. Coffee cups froze halfway to lips. Every officer in that tired, fluorescent-lit space instinctively turned to look. What they saw standing in the doorway wasn't a man. It was a storm wearing a suit. Walter Tate, retired FBI special agent in charge, entered the Savannah precinct like he owned every brick in its crumbling walls. He moved slowly, deliberately, his back straight, his shoulders squared, his gaze sharp enough to cut through steel. Decades of leading high-profile investigations and taking down criminal syndicates had carved a quiet, lethal power into his frame. And tonight, every ounce of it was aimed directly at the officers before him. The sergeant behind the booking desk swallowed hard, rising to his feet. Officer Miller, halfway through scrolling his phone, tucked it away like a schoolboy caught cheating on a test. Even the more seasoned officers, the ones who had laughed off Gloria's arrest, straightened instinctively, their bodies reacting before their minds could catch up. Authority like Walter's didn't need a raised voice. It was felt in the air itself. But then there was Officer Rick Coleman, leaning against the holding cell hallway, arms crossed, lips curled in a defiant sneer. He was the only one who didn't shift, didn't avert his gaze. Instead, he pushed off the wall and swaggered toward the entrance, like a man who still thought he could control this night. "Can I help you?" Coleman drawled, his voice oily, insincere. "Yay, lawyer or something?" Walter's gaze swept across the room before settling coldly on Coleman. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached slowly into his coat pocket and produced a leather badge wallet. With a flick of his wrist, he opened it, revealing the unmistakable golden eagle crest of the FBI and the well-worn credentials beneath. "Walter Tate," he said evenly, his voice like gravel polished smooth by years of battle. "Retired special agent in charge, Civil Rights Division." A collective inhale swept through the room. "I'm here for my daughter," Walter continued, his tone steady but sharp. "A nurse with no criminal record, no outstanding warrants, and every legal right to pick up her prescription without harassment." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Coleman's smirk faltered just slightly, but he recovered quickly, forcing a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Look, Mr. Tate, this is just a simple misunderstanding," Coleman said, spreading his hands in a practiced gesture of faux sincerity. "We were called about a possible fraud situation. Standard procedure. No harm, no foul." Walter didn't blink. "Standard procedure," he repeated softly, letting the words hang in the air like smoke. Is it standard procedure to arrest someone without verifying their identity? To dismiss valid documentation? To humiliate a healthcare worker in public after a 16-hour shift? Behind him, the precinct door swung open again, more quietly this time. Two figures entered, their dark suits and earpieces giving them away instantly. Federal agents. They moved with calm efficiency, surveying the room, nodding once at Walter before beginning their quiet work in the background. Coleman's eyes flicked toward them, his jaw tightening. Walter took one step forward, his voice dropping just enough to make every ear strain to hear. I suggest you start explaining why my daughter is in a holding cell, officer. And I suggest you do it very carefully. For a long, breathless moment, the room stood frozen in place. Officer Coleman's face twitched, a mixture of arrogance and dawning panic tugging at his features. He tried to summon the swagger that had carried him through countless late-night stops and unchecked abuses, but something in Walter Tate's gaze cut through all of it. That wasn't the look of a man filing a complaint. That was the look of a man preparing an indictment. Coleman straightened, clearing his throat. Like I said, Mr. Tate, your daughter was flagged for suspicious activity. The pharmacy manager called us, claiming there was a mismatch with her insurance information. We responded according to protocol. Walter's eyebrow lifted slowly, his expression unreadable. Protocol, he echoed, voice like steel. I didn't ask about the pharmacy manager's biases. I asked what you did. Did you check her identification? Coleman hesitated, his mouth opening and closing like a fish stranded on dry land. She refused to cooperate, he said finally, the words sharp but unsteady. She was evasive, defensive. Walter tilted his head, his voice colder now. She handed you her driver's license, her insurance card, and her prescription. That's your definition of evasive? The sergeant behind the desk shifted uncomfortably, his chair creaking beneath him. Officer Miller glanced at the floor, avoiding everyone's gaze. The two federal agents at the back of the room were quietly reviewing security footage, their earpieces crackling softly. Walter let the silence stretch just long enough to make it unbearable. Then, he spoke again, each word deliberate and razor-edged. You didn't see a nurse trying to pick up medication. You saw a black woman alone at night, and you made her your target. Coleman's face flushed crimson. What shit? He snapped, but the bite in his voice rang hollow. Walter didn't move. No, officer, you watch it. Because as of this moment, this precinct is under preliminary review for civil rights violations. And believe me, your department's history isn't going to help your case. The words landed like hammer blows. Even the most skeptical officers in the room felt the weight of what was unfolding. This wasn't going to blow over with a disciplinary hearing or a few weeks of desk duty. This was the kind of storm that tore careers apart. One of the federal agents stepped forward, nodding toward Walter. Sir, we've pulled the call logs and initial arrest report. No probable cause documented. Body cam footage is being downloaded now. Coleman shifted his weight, the bravado draining from his posture. You don't have jurisdiction here, he tried weakly. Walter's smile was thin, humorless. Federal civil rights law begs to differ. The sergeant behind the desk finally spoke, his voice hoarse. What do you want us to do? Walter didn't hesitate. Unlock the holding cell. Now. No one moved for a second. Then the sergeant scrambled for his keys, nearly dropping them in his haste. The clink of metal echoed through the silent room as he fumbled toward the cell block. Walter turned his gaze back to Coleman one last time. You thought she was alone. That was your first mistake. And with that, he followed the sergeant toward the cells, his steps slow, steady, unstoppable. The clanking of keys against steel echoed through the dim hallway as Walter and the sergeant reached the holding cells. Every footstep seemed louder in that confined space, each breath hanging in the cold fluorescent light. Gloria sat on the narrow metal bench, her posture straight despite the ache in her back and wrists. She had heard the voices, she knew who was coming. When Walter appeared in the doorway, their eyes met, and, for the first time that night, Something soft cracked through her iron resolve. Relief, fierce and quiet, flashed between them. Unspoken, but undeniable. Walter gave a small nod, a silent message. "I'm here. You're safe now." The sergeant fumbled with the lock, his hands shaking slightly. The heavy door groaned as it swung open, but Gloria didn't rush to her feet. She stood slowly, with purpose, gathering her dignity like a cloak. Her wrists wore angry red marks where the handcuffs had cut into her skin, but she didn't hide them. She let them be seen. Walter stepped aside, gesturing for her to walk out first. She did, head high, shoulders square. Every step a quiet declaration of defiance. She passed the sergeant without a glance, her focus fixed ahead. As they walked back toward the front of the station, the shift in the air was unmistakable. Officers straightened along the hallway. Some avoided her gaze, shame and uncertainty flickering across their faces. Others stared outright, struggling to reconcile the woman before them with the criminal they had imagined. At the booking desk, Coleman stood frozen, his face drained of color. His hands twitched at his sides, his jaw clenched tight. Miller stood behind him, shoulders hunched, looking for all the world like he wanted to disappear. Gloria stopped in front of them, letting the silence stretch. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough to expose the hollow authority they had tried to wield over her. For a long beat, no one moved. Then Walter broke the silence, his voice calm but cutting. "It's over." Coleman opened his mouth as if to protest, to salvage some scrap of control, but Walter silenced him with a look. "Don't. Every word you say from this point on will be reviewed by federal counsel. I suggest you save yourself the embarrassment." The federal agents stepped forward, flanking Walter and Gloria like quiet sentinels. Their presence made it clear that this wasn't a rescue. This was a reckoning. Walter placed a steadying hand on Gloria's shoulder, just for a moment. Then he turned to the desk sergeant. "We'll be reviewing your incident reports, your body cam footage, your complaint logs. I suggest full cooperation." The sergeant could only nod, his throat working to swallow words he couldn't form. Without another word, Gloria turned and walked toward the exit. She didn't look back, not at the holding cell, not at Coleman, not at the walls that had tried to break her. The night air hit her like a wave of freedom, humid and thick, but somehow lighter than the stale precinct air. The sky stretched wide and endless above her. For the first time in hours, she breathed deep and easy. This fight wasn't over, but she was free. The precinct's harsh fluorescent lights seemed to dim as Walter Tate took a slow step forward, his presence filling the room like a gathering storm. The officers who had smirked and whispered before now stood awkwardly silent, shifting their weight and avoiding eye contact. At the booking desk, the balding sergeant fumbled with paperwork, his hands suddenly too clumsy for the task. Walter's voice, low and unhurried, cut through the tension like a razor. "Let's start with something simple," he said, setting his FBI credentials on the counter with a quiet finality. "Explain to me how a licensed nurse with valid identification and no criminal record ends up in your holding cell tonight." For a long, terrible second, no one answered. Officer Coleman, standing stiff and red-faced near the hallway, opened his mouth to speak, but Walter's gaze pinned him in place before a single word could escape. The sergeant cleared his throat, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to salvage control. There was a discrepancy with her prescription, sir. Standard procedure. We contacted the authorities for verification." Walter tilted his head slightly, a quiet, deadly calm radiating from him. "Standard procedure, is it?" he repeated, each word heavy with disbelief. "Your standard procedure skipped verifying her ID, skipped confirming her insurance, and skipped even speaking to her about slapping cuffs on her in front of a crowd." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a growl. "And your standard procedure is about to cost this department everything." In the background, the low hum of activity shifted. Federal agents, quiet, methodical, had begun setting up laptops on folding tables, pulling body cam footage from charging docks, and logging evidence faster than the precinct could react. Screens blinked to life one by one, displaying raw footage that had been captured just hours before. The truth unfiltered and undeniable. Walter's voice softened, but the room felt colder. You all thought this would disappear by morning. Another tired black woman, humiliated, processed, forgotten. His eyes scanned the room, landing on each officer in turn. But what you didn't know is that tonight your arrogance was documented, and now it belongs to the United States Department of Justice. The sergeant paled, sweat beading at his brow. We didn't know who she was. Walter's smile was thin, humorless. That's exactly the problem. A federal agent in the corner of the room cleared her throat. We've got it loaded, sir. Walter nodded once. Play it. The room fell deathly silent as the first frames flickered across the monitor. There it was, the entire arrest captured from Officer Coleman's chest cam. Gloria handing over her ID calmly, the pharmacy manager's smug accusations, Coleman's dismissal of her explanation, the rough, unnecessary grip on her wrists as the cuffs were slapped on. Gloria's voice steady and dignified as she said the words that now hung in the air like a prophecy. No one spoke, no one moved, because there it was, laid bare for all to see, the truth, and no one in that room could hide from it anymore. The tension inside the precinct grew thicker with every passing minute. Officer Miller, still lurking near the hallway, finally found the courage to ask in a low, hesitant voice, "What happens now, sir?" Walter Tate turned to him, his expression as cold as steel. "Now?" he echoed, his voice soft but sharp. "Now we start pulling back the curtains on this little theater of injustice you've all been running." Before Miller could respond, the federal agent reviewing the body cam footage spoke up. "We've got something," he said, turning his tablet toward the gathered officers. "Playback starts now." The room fell silent as the footage began to roll. The dim lighting of the pharmacy flickered on the screen, illuminating the scene like a ghost from the past. Gloria's calm, tired voice rang out, clear and steady. "Here's my ID, my insurance card, my prescription." She spoke with the quiet dignity of someone used to fighting for her place in the world. But then came Coleman's voice, cutting across the calm like a blade. "Step outside, now." No review of her documents, no verification of facts, just immediate suspicion, immediate condemnation. The video played on, showing Coleman grabbing Gloria's wrist roughly, despite her clear cooperation. Miller stood in the background, his discomfort plain but his voice silent. The pharmacy manager watched from the counter, her folded arms and smug smile captured in damning clarity. A few officers shifted uncomfortably as they watched, realizing how bad it looked, how bad it was. The footage ended with Gloria's steady words as she was led away in handcuffs. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." Walter turned to face the sergeant, the room heavy with the weight of truth finally spoken aloud. "This isn't interpretation," Walter said quietly. "This is fact, recorded, time-stamped, undeniable." The sergeant wiped a hand over his face, the reality of their situation settling like a stone in his stomach. He opened his mouth to respond, but the phone at the front desk rang sharply. Intermembering either moment, he snatched it up, his voice brittle. "Savannah PD." A pause. Then his face drained of color. He listened for a few tense seconds, nodding silently. When he hung up, his voice shook. "That was Washington again. They want a full incident report." Walter didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply stated the truth. "Your night just made national news." Around the precinct, officers exchanged panicked glances. They knew what was coming. National coverage meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant accountability. And accountability meant the cracks they'd spent years covering up were about to burst wide open. In the background, another federal agent began organizing files, tagging names, and timestamps. Every injustice, every lie, every abuse of power, now neatly cataloged for investigation. As the weight of the moment settled, Walter looked toward Gloria, who stood quietly by his side. She met his gaze with a steady nod, her dignity intact despite everything. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but tonight, the walls had finally begun to crack, and there was no going back. The first tremors hit social media like a tidal wave, fast and merciless. A pharmacy customer's shaky phone footage hit Twitter just before midnight. Gloria's calm refusal, Coleman's rough grip, the cold snap of handcuffs echoing across the tiled floor. Within minutes, the video was shared across platforms, retweeted by activists, nurses' unions, and civil rights advocates. By dawn, the hashtag "nurses are not criminals" were trending noisily. Walter watched it unfold from the precinct's side office, where a federal agent had set up a temporary command post. Screens flickered with live feeds of social media outrage. Thousands of comments, reposts, and reaction videos calling for accountability. Nurses from New York to California posted videos in solidarity, posting up their hospital badges and saying, "We are Gloria Tate." Inside the precinct, panic set in. Officers scrambled, calling their supervisors, union reps, and PR contacts. But the damage was already done. The story had slipped from their control. Every second they hesitated, more people were watching, analyzing, and judging their actions. News vans parked outside, their satellite dishes aimed at the precinct like watchful eyes. Reporters crowded the steps, broadcasting live segments, demanding answers from Savannah. The desk sergeant wiped sweat from his brow, his voice tight, as he barked at an officer. "Pull the department's statement from last month's racial sensitivity training. Release it now!" But Walter shook his head from across the room. It's too late for pre-written apologies. People want accountability, not empty words. Gloria stood quietly in the corner, watching it all unfold. Her phone buzzed endlessly with missed calls, messages of support, and press requests. But she ignored them for now. She wasn't chasing headlines. She was waiting for justice to finally walk through the door. And then, as if on cue, another phone rang at the front desk. This time, the caller ID flashed a number that made the sergeant's stomach drop. Office of the Deputy Attorney General, Washington, D.C. The sergeant hesitated for a beat, then lifted the receiver with a trembling hand. "Savannah, PA," he answered, his voice cracking slightly. A pause. Then, "Yes, sir, she's here. Yes, sir, I understand. Immediately, sir." He hung up and turned to Walter, his face pale. "They want to speak to Ms. Tate, directly." Walter gave a slight nod and turned to Gloria, his voice steady. "It's your call now." For a moment, the room held its breath. And then Gloria stepped forward, calm and resolute. She took the phone, her voice low but unwavering. "This is Gloria Tate." The room fell silent as she spoke, each word measured and clear. The storm outside was still raging, but for the first time in hours, the precinct itself felt eerily still, caught in the quiet before the next thunderclap. The Savannah night had turned restless. What started as quiet outrage had grown into a storm. Neighbors, healthcare workers, and students gathered outside the precinct, their faces lit by candles and cell phones raised high. Some held signs, "Justice for Glory," "Black Nurses Matter," and "The Accountability Now." Their voices rose into the humid Georgia air, chanting her name over and over. "Say her name, Gloria Tate." Media vans lined the streets, reporters scrambling to set up cameras, as drones buzzed overhead, capturing the growing sea of people. Friends texted each other urgently, "Turn on the news. Savannah's burning tonight." This was no longer a local incident. It was a national moment unfolding in real time. Inside the precinct, panic spread like wildfire. Officers huddled in corners, scrolling through trending hashtags. Some still tried to strategize. Sergeant Harwood slammed his hand on the table and barked, "We spin this, say she resisted arrest. Control the story." But his voice wavered, and in his eyes, even he knew the truth was already out. The body cam footage was clear. There was no hiding it now. Officer Miller sat pale and restless in the corner. "They've got everything. We can't spin this." Coleman, arms crossed tight, still clung to his crumbling arrogance. "We followed procedure," he muttered, but even he didn't sound convinced. Meanwhile, Walter Tate moved with quiet purpose. Stepping away from the noise, he called the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Unit. His voice was calm but sharp. "Activate the Savannah team. We've got systemic abuse unfolding right now. I want oversaw and ASCOR on every officer in that building before sunrise." The response was swift. Agents were on their way. When Walter returned to the precinct doors, he found Gloria beneath the flickering streetlight. Her body was weary, but her gaze was steady. Reporters shouted questions. She raised her hand and silence fell. Then she spoke, her voice firm and clear. "This isn't just about me. It's about every nurse, every worker, every black woman told their lives don't matter. It's about every voice they tried to silence. But not tonight, and not..." The crowd roared in response, voices shaking the walls of the precinct behind her. And for the first time that night, Savannah felt something shift. Gloria had reclaimed her dignity in front of the world, and there was no going back. Inside the precinct, tension boiled over. Officers who once spoke with certainty now whispered in frantic bursts, their voices tight with fear. Sergeant Harwood paced the floor, sweat beading on his brow as he barked orders no one fully obeyed. Secure the exits, shut down external comms. But it was too late. The story had already slipped through their fingers and flooded the world outside. Officer Miller, usually silent in the shadow of Coleman, sat hunched at his desk, scrolling through his phone. He watched the footage play over and over again. Gloria's quiet dignity, the rough arrest, the cold dismissal of her truth. His hands trembled as reality settled in. They were wrong. They had been wrong from the start, and now the whole world could see it. Coleman, on the other hand, clung to bravado like a drowning man clutching driftwood. He barked back at Miller, "Stay focused. We protect the badge always." But even his voice cracked. He could see the looks from fellow officers, some of them questioning, some of them cold. His kingdom was collapsing from within, and the weight of it pressed down hard. Walter stood quietly in the background, watching it all unfold. He didn't need to shout. His presence alone was enough to shift the balance. Moments later, his phone buzzed. DOJ field agents had arrived outside, quietly blending into the crowd and preparing to enter. Savannah PD was no longer in control. Federal oversight was here. Walter turned back to Gloria, who stood steady beside him. He gave a slight nodule of her brave, but also warning. The fight was far from over. Gloria, exhausted but unbroken, took a long breath as the next wave of reporters pushed forward. Their voices cut through the night air. "Gloria, what happens next? Are you filing charges? Do you trust the justice system?" She met their questions with quiet strength. "This isn't the end. It's the beginning of accountability. For me, and for everyone who has been silenced." And with those words, the battle lines were drawn. Inside the station, panic. Outside, unity. And above it all, the promise of a reckoning no one could stop. The crowd outside swelled into the hundreds as midnight approached. Candle flames flickered in the humid breeze, casting soft halos across upturned faces. Some prayed softly, others chanted with raw voices, but all of them stood united in purpose. This was no longer just about Gloria. It was about every wrong done in silence, every truth buried under a badge. Inside the precinct, the storm finally broke. Federal agents entered through the front doors without knocking, their dark suits a stark contrast to the trembling uniforms around them. No words were wasted. They moved like they belonged there, setting up laptops, demanding passwords, and beginning a full audit on the spot. The atmosphere turned glacial. Savannah and No found themselves frozen in place. Sergeant Harwood tried to salvage what little authority he had left, approaching Walter with a trembling voice. "This isn't Procoal. You're making a mistake." But Walter didn't flinch. "The mistake was made hours ago. We're just correcting it." He turned to the lead DOJ agent, giving a single nod. "Proceed?" The body cams were pulled, reports were seized, and for the first time in years, Savannah's dirty laundry was being aired in full view of the law. Officer Coleman sat at his desk, fists clenched, jaw grinding. He tried to bark orders at the younger officers, but no one listened anymore. His power had evaporated the moment he put those cuffs on Gloria Tate. Out front, the press broadcast live as Gloria stood before the cameras. She didn't smile, didn't soften the moment. "We are tired of asking for dignity," she said. "Now we're demanding it." Behind her, the crowd roared her name, a wall of voices breaking through the night. And, for the first time in that precinct's long, troubled history, silence fell where arrogance once lived. The first files hit the DOJ monitors just before dawn. Thick folders, digitally archived yet carelessly hidden, suddenly burst open under federal scrutiny. Names, dates, complaints, each line more damning than the last. Gloria sat beside Walter in the conference room, exhaustion lining her face, but her eyes locked on the screen. These weren't isolated incidents, they were pattern. Federal agents moved through the Savannah PD's database like a storm. They unearthed dozens of excessive force complaints against Officer Coleman. Cases where young black men were shoved against patrol cars, where elderly citizens were dragged from their porches, where people with no criminal record were booked for resisting an arrest that should never have happened. Each complaint carried a familiar pattern. Officer Miller's record wasn't much cleaner. Though quieter, his complicity ran deep. He had backed Coleman, Cosembarda reports, and looked away when rules were broken. Internal Affairs had flagged them both multiple times, but nothing had ever come of it. Supervisors had brushed complaints aside, citing insufficient evidence or procedural compliance. Walter read through the files, his jaw tight, his mind racing. He'd seen corruption before, but Savannah's rot ran deeper than he feared. It wasn't just Coleman and Miller. It was a system built to protect itself, layer after layer of silence, denial, and cover-up. Gloria placed a hand on his arm, grounding him. He took a slow breath and nodded. They had work to do. By mid-morning, the first victim stepped forward. People who had been waiting in the shadows, afraid to speak. Until now, an older man in his 70s recounted how Coleman had arrested him for loitering outside his own home. A Latina woman described a terrifying night when Miller handcuffed her for questioning his authority during a traffic stop. And then came the story that shattered Savannah's morning calm. A teenage boy, no older than 15, stood at a hastily arranged press conference, with his mother by his side. His voice trembled as he recounted being thrown face against a police cruiser, his head hitting the metal so hard he blacked out. His crime? Walking home from basketball practice in the wrong neighborhood. A reporter captured his tearful words. "They told me I fit the description, but they didn't say what the description was." The video of his story hit social media within minutes. Hashtags exploded. Justice for Malika. Enough is enough. Walter watched from the precinct's temporary command post, fists clenched at his sides. This wasn't about just one case anymore. It was a reckoning, and they were only getting started. The next wave of revelations hit even harder. As DOJ agents interviewed former officers who had quietly resigned from the Savannah PD, more cracks in the department's foundation came to light. A retired sergeant named Ellis Green, once silenced by loyalty and fear, finally spoke. His testimony was damning. Green described how complaints against Coleman and Miller were routinely lost in paperwork shuffles. Supervisors gave quiet warnings instead of disciplinary actions. And when Green had tried to escalate a particularly violent arrest, he was pressured into early retirement. Walter listened, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. But inside, his anger boiled. How many voices had been buried by that culture of silence? How many lives had been scarred by the refusal to act? Meanwhile, Gloria stepped into a different battle. She met privately with local activists, clergy members, and healthcare workers, people whose communities had suffered at the hands of unchecked authority for years. They weren't just angry, they were organized. Plans for peaceful demonstrations, community healing circles, and legal aid workshops spread like wildfire across the city. What started as a spark outside the precinct had now become a citywide call to action. In Washington, the DJ's Civil Rights Division officially launched a full-scale federal audit of the Savannah Police Department. The announcement broke across every major news outlet by noon. Savannah was no longer a local scandal, it was now a national headline. Back at the precinct, officers scrambled. Some tried to distance themselves from Coleman and Miller, claiming they had no idea what had been happening. Others whispered in corners, weighing whether to resign or wait for the inevitable fallout, but the truth was unavoidable. The walls were closing in, And the old ways, the silence, the cover-ups, the quiet complicity were collapsing with them. Walters stood before the precinct's remaining leadership, his voice low but unflinching. This department protected predators for far too long. That ends today. He paused, letting the silence settle like a verdict. And if you can't stand on the side of justice, step aside, or be swept away with the rest. The full weight of the moment crashed down as federal agents began locking down evidence. They secured the internal servers, pulled surveillance footage, and combed through decades of personnel files. The Savannah PD's command structure was paralyzed, officers either too stunned or too guilty to intervene. Every hallway that once carried quiet arrogance now echoed with uncertainty and fear. But in the midst of that chaos, Walters' resolve hardened. He gathered his team of federal agents in the precinct's cramped briefing room. This isn't about punishing one department, he told them. This is about showing every corrupt officer in this country that we will find you, we will expose you, and we will break your shield of silence. His voice was steady, but beneath it ran the fury of a man who had seen too many lives broken by unchecked power. Outside, Gloria stood before a growing crowd of supporters. She was tired. The exhaustion from the last 24 hours etched into her face. But her voice carried across the square with unwavering strength. "This isn't just about me," she said, pausing to meet the gaze of the hundreds gathered. "It's about every person they thought they could silence, every voice they tried to erase. Not anymore." Cheers erupted from the crowd, echoing down the streets of Savannah. Hashtags filled social media screens across the country. Violence continued. Justice for Gloria, Savannah reckoning, break the shield. And back inside the precinct, an officer who had once laughed at Coleman's joke now stared at the live news broadcast on his phone. His hands trembled slightly as he realized the old world was gone, and it wasn't coming back. With that, the storm moved from the precinct's walls into Savannah's streets and beyond. The morning sun barely filtered through the thick Georgia humidity as officers Coleman and Miller were summoned to the precinct's main briefing room. Their uniforms were crisp, their expressions guarded. They walked in like men who believed they still controlled the narrative. But the sight awaiting them stripped away any illusion of control. Federal officials, flanked by local oversight representatives, and journalists who had somehow gotten wind of the meeting, stood waiting. A stern-faced DJ agent stepped forward, a folder thick with damning evidence in his hands. "Effective immediately," the agent announced, "Officers Coleman and Miller are suspended pending the outcome of a federal investigation into civil rights violations, excessive force, and unlawful arrest." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. A ripple of murmurs followed. Some officers exchanged uneasy glances, while others looked down at the floor, unwilling to meet anyone's gaze. Coleman crossed his arms, his jaw clenched, a thin smile curling at the corner of his mouth. "This is political," he sneered, forcing bravado into his voice. "You're making a mistake." But even as he spoke, his fingers twitched restlessly at his sides, betraying the fear gnawing at the edges of his arrogance. Miller said nothing. He stood a step behind Coleman, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. The bravado had long since drained from him. The agent gave no response to Coleman's defiance. Instead, he gestured for two officers to collect their badges and weapons. Coleman ripped the badge from his chest, slamming it onto the desk with a clatter that echoed through the silent room. Miller followed, slower, his movements reluctant, as if hoping to delay the inevitable. The sight of their badges, symbols of unchecked power, now stripped away. As they were escorted from the room, Gloria's words from the night before lingered in the air. "You're going to regret this." And regret, it seemed, was finally beginning to take root. Outside the station, reporters shouted questions, cameras flashing like lightning. The world was watching, and for once, the shadows of Savannah's corruption could no longer hide its rot. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere shifted from tense to chaotic. Federal agents wasted no time asserting control. One group moved swiftly through the evidence room, cataloging every piece of body cam footage from the past 5 years. Another team entered the records office, their presence a clear signal that no file, no report, and no secret was safe anymore. The department's servers, once considered untouchable, were now being cloned by DOJ forensic techs who worked silently. their fingers dancing across keyboards as they pulled years of hidden misconduct into the light. At the front desk, the sergeant who had once barked orders with impunity now found himself answering questions from federal attorneys with ice-cold precision. Each question cut deeper, peeling back layers of lies that had shielded the department for decades. Paper trails long thought buried were suddenly exposed, connecting complaints that had been dismissed, investigations that had been stalled, and cover-ups that had been rubber-stamped by supervisors too cowardly to confront the truth. In the squad room, officers whispered in tight circles. Some expressed anger at the federal interference, clinging to denial. Others, their faces pale with realization, knew the party was over. The old way of doing business, of closing ranks and protecting their own, had been shattered. Their sanctuary was gone, replaced by the cold, sterile light of accountability. Meanwhile, Gloria watched it all unfold from a distance, standing in the corner, near the interrogation rooms. Though exhaustion weighed heavy on her shoulders, she refused to look away. This was what she had fought for, endured for. Every keystroke, every seized file, every whispered confession was proof that her suffering hadn't been in vain. But even now, she knew the fight was far from finished. Federal agents compiled reports, stacking them neatly into thick folders that would soon land on the desks of prosecutors and oversight committees. By nightfall, names would be named, charges would be drafted, and Savannah PD, once an untouchable fortress, would stand exposed to the judgment of the nation. That night, as Savannah's streets buzzed with whispers of the day's events, Gloria finally returned home. The modest bungalow felt different now, quieter somehow. She set her keys down on the worn kitchen counter and stood in the stillness, letting the silence settle over her like a fragile blanket. For the first time in hours, she was alone. No reporters, no flashing cameras, no agents rifling through decades of corruption. Just her, the hum of the refrigerator, and the distant echoes of a city in turmoil. She sat on the edge of her couch, her body aching from the strain of the past 48 hours. The handcuff bruises on her wrists were still tender, a reminder of how quickly dignity could be stripped away. And yet, beneath the weariness, something steady pulsed in her chest. Resolve. This wasn't the end, not by a long shot. Her phone buzzed beside her. For a moment, she debated ignoring it, but then she glanced at the screen. Marcus Dean, the civil rights attorney Walter had spoken of. She answered with a tired but steady voice. "Gloria Tate," she said. "Miss Tate." Marcus's voice came through, calm but urgent. "First, let me say what happened to you was an outrage. But it's bigger than that. This isn't just about you. It's about a system that's failed countless people in Savannah." She nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle in her bones. "I know," she said simply. Marcus didn't hesitate. "I want to build a class-action lawsuit, not just against the officers who did this, but against the entire department and city leadership that allowed it to happen. I've already spoken to several other victims. People are ready to stand with you, but they need someone to lead the charge, someone the public trusts." Gloria closed her eyes, the exhaustion warring with a deeper truth. She hadn't asked for this fight, but she couldn't walk away now, not when so many others still lived in fear of what she had survived. "I'll do it," she said quietly but firmly. There was a pause on the other end, and then Marcus spoke, his voice filled with quiet gratitude. "Then, let's make history, Ms. Tate. Together." As the call ended, Gloria sat back against the worn cushion, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned slowly overhead. Tomorrow, the battle would begin anew, in courtrooms, in press recourses, in community meetings where voices long silenced would finally be heard. But for tonight, she allowed herself one small breath of peace. The reckoning had begun. The community center buzzed with quiet tension as Gloria stepped inside, the wooden floors creaking beneath her feet. Folding chairs were arranged in haphazard rows, filled with faces marked by exhaustion, anger, and something rarer, hope. These were not politicians or activists chasing headlines. They were ordinary people, worn thin by years of silent suffering at the hands of a system that treated them like ghosts. Tonight, they were finally being seen. Gloria found a seat in the second row, not at the front, where some urged her to sit. She wanted to listen first. A middle-aged man with a salt and pepper beard stood at the front, his voice steady but raw. 2 years ago, Coleman pulled me over. Said a taillight was out. I had just fixed it that morning. Before I could grab my license, he had me face down on the asphalt. He paused, his voice catching. Daughter was in the back seat. The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing against the walls. One by one, they shared their truths. A single mother falsely arrested while walking home from her night shift. A teenager accused of theft without evidence. An elderly woman forced to spend a night in holding for asking too many questions. Their stories poured out, weaving a tapestry of injustice, stretching back years, if not decades. Gloria clenched her fists beneath the folding table, her nails digging into her palms. She had known her arrest wasn't an isolated case, but hearing these voices gave it shape and depth she hadn't fully grasped. These people weren't statistics in a DOJ report. They were neighbors, parents, children, and the system had failed them all. When the last speaker sat down, a hush settled over the room. Eyes turned to Gloria, not because she had asked for their attention, but because they needed her to say something. She rose slowly, steadying her voice against the lump in her throat. "I'm not here tonight because I'm special," she said softly. "I'm here because what happened to me could happen to any of us, and it has. For too long, we've been told to sit down, stay quiet, and accept it. But no more." She looked out at the sea of tired, determined faces. "I can't promise this will be easy, but I can promise you this: we will not be silent. We will not stand alone." Applause filled the room, not the polite kind, but the thunderous, defiant kind that shakes rafters and hearts alike. The movement had a face now, and its voice was just beginning to rise. The next morning, civil rights attorney Marcus Dean stood outside the Savannah courthouse, holding a thick manila folder packed with affidavits, reports, and damning evidence. His team had worked through the night, assembling what Gloria could only describe as the blueprint of an institutional-wide cover-up. Reporters gathered in the courtyard, microphones and cameras pointed toward the courthouse steps. "Today," Marcus began, "we are filing a federal class-action lawsuit against the Savannah Police Department, its leadership, and city officials. This isn't just about one arrest. It's about a culture of unchecked power, systemic abuse, and civil rights violations that have gone unanswered for far too long." The lawsuit alleged everything from unlawful arrest and excessive force to racial profiling and evidence tampering. Dozens of plaintiffs were named, their stories echoing the pain Gloria had endured. The document itself felt like a reckoning, its weight carried not just by the pages, but by the voices finally given a chance to speak. Inside the courthouse, the legal machinery ground to life. Savannah's city attorneys scrambled to prepare a response, issuing carefully crafted press statements, denying systemic wrongdoing while promising cooperation. But the public wasn't buying it. Social media exploded with hashtags like "Justice for Gloria Catastronis, the End Record," and "Endless Americas" began arriving in Savannah, cameras rolling as they documented a city teetering between denial and accountability. By evening, the Savannah PD's official website had been hacked, replaced with a stark black screen and the words, "Your time is up." No one claimed responsibility, but the message resonated across the nation. Gloria watched it all unfold from her living room, the TV casting harsh shadows across her walls. She felt the weight of it pressing against her chest, a mixture of vindication and dread. The fight was only just beginning. Late that afternoon, the Department of Justice held a press conference outside the federal courthouse. The air was thick with anticipation. Reporters jostled for position as U.S. Attorney Rachel Porter stepped to the podium, flanked by 2 senior DOJ officials and Walter Tate, standing quietly to the side. Porter spoke without flourish, her voice cool and steady. After a preliminary investigation by the DOJ Civil Rights Division, and in light of overwhelming evidence, she began, "We are filing federal criminal charges against officers Rick Coleman and David Miller for unlawful arrest, obstruction of justice, and willful deprivation of civil rights under color of law. The crowd erupted in a frenzy of shouted questions and flashing cameras. Walter stood still, his hands folded before him, watching as the truth finally saw daylight. For Gloria, it was surreal to see the names of the men who humiliated her now etched into a federal indictment. But she knew this was only the beginning. Accountability was rare and fragile. They would fight tooth and nail to keep their power, to spin their narrative. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere curdled into chaos. Coleman raged against the news, shouting that he was being railroaded, a scapegoat. But the other officers had begun to distance themselves, whispering in corners, slipping away from the storm they now realized was unavoidable. Miller sat alone at his desk, head bowed, finally understanding the full weight of what they had done. Outside, protesters gathered once again, their signs higher, their chants louder. Savannah had reached a crossroads. The city could cling to its old ghosts or finally face them. Gloria watched it unfold from the courthouse steps, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a small, exhausted smile. The reckoning had begun, and it wasn't hers to carry alone anymore. But in her heart, she knew the next battle was looming. Accountability wasn't enough. The system had to change, and if Savannah could be the place where that change began, then maybe, just maybe, everything she endured would be worth it. The federal courtroom in Savannah was packed, the air thick with anticipation and the collective breath of a city standing on the edge of reckoning. Reporters lined the back walls, their notebooks and cameras ready to capture every word, every reaction. Families of victims, community leaders, and ordinary citizens who had once been silenced by fear now filled the rows, their faces a tapestry of quiet strength and long-awaited justice. Some held hands tightly, knuckles white. Others sat with tears welling in their eyes, knowing this moment was bigger than one trial. It was a reckoning for years of buried pain. Gloria sat near the front, her posture steady, hands folded calmly in her lap, Walter beside her, a silent pillar of support. Though she looked outwardly composed, inside her chest her heart beat a fierce rhythm, steady but unrelenting, matching the pulse of change surging through the room. For months, she'd carried the weight of this fight. Tonight, she was ready to release it. The jury filed in, solemn and deliberate, their faces unreadable. Each step they took echoed through the chamber like the march of history. The foreperson, a woman with steel gray hair and a voice that carried quiet authority, rose to her feet. You could have heard a pin drop. Every breath in the courtroom hitched as she opened the verdict slip and began to read. Rick Coleman down on wealthy regulated the suit, but not the violence in the room. We foreperson began. Rick Coleman A ripple of restrained emotion swept through the courtroom. People gasped quietly. A collective release of tension, but also a sobering confirmation. For so long, justice had seemed out of reach. Now, at last, the tide was turning. Gloria remained still, her heart pounding, but her face composed, unwilling to let them see how much it meant to her. Dignity was her shield. On the charge of obstruction of justice, the voice continued, we find the defendant, David Miller, guilty. The list of charges continued: civil rights violations, falsifying police reports, abuse of authority. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Each word fell like a stone into the stillness of the room, reshaping the narrative of a city that had too often let injustice go unanswered. The verdicts echoed in the marble and oak of the old courthouse, ringing like bells that would not be silenced. Coleman sat slumped at the defense table, his once arrogant demeanor now reduced to pale silence. The smirk he had worn like a mask for so long was gone. Miller's shoulders sagged, his hands trembling faintly. Neither man looked toward Gloria. They didn't have the courage. Their power had evaporated, leaving only the fragile shells of men who once believed they were untouchable. The judge's gavel echoed sharply, signaling the end of the trial, but not the end of the story. A hush lingered before people stirred, exchanging tearful embraces and hushed prayers. Gloria exhaled slowly, releasing months of tension and fear. Around her, quiet tears were wiped away, hands clasped in gratitude and relief. and smiles broke. Fasissa had forgotten what hope felt like. Walter placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, the weight of his presence grounding her. "You did it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion he rarely showed. But Gloria shook her head slightly, a small, knowing smile crossing her lips. "We did it, all of us." And in that moment they both knew. This victory wasn't just for her, it was for every person who had suffered in silence, every family who had buried their pain, and every voice that had been silenced by fear. Justice had spoken, but the work was far from over. The days that followed the verdict swept through Savannah like a cleansing storm. Headlines blazed across national news outlets. Savannah PH officers found guilty in landmark civil rights case. Social media erupted with messages of support, survivor stories, and calls for broader reform. Candlelight vigils stretched across the courthouse steps and town squares, illuminating the night with the glow of resilience and unity. But inside City Hall, the real battle for lasting change had just begun. In the weeks following the trial, Savannah's leadership faced unrelenting pressure from federal oversight and public demand. City council meetings stretched late into the night, packed with outraged citizens and community leaders who demanded action, not empty promises. Pressers lined the streets outside, holding signs that read, "Rebuild, Reform, Respect." The mayor, once silent during the storm, now stood at the podium, flanked by newly appointed officials, reading from a long, detailed reform package. Effective immediately, Savannah PD would be subject to independent oversight by a newly established civilian review board, composed of diverse members from the community. This board would have full authority to investigate misconduct, review use of force incidents, and recommend disciplinary actions, powers that no previous oversight body had been granted. Officers would undergo mandatory racial bias and de-escalation training, and all body camera footage would be made publicly accessible through quarterly audits. Leadership changes followed swiftly. The police chief, who had quietly resigned in the days leading up to the verdict, was replaced by a reform-minded leader from outside the state, a woman with a proven record of transforming corrupt departments. Several senior officers implicated in past cover-ups either stepped down or faced disciplinary hearings of their own. The old guard, which had protected men like Coleman and Miller for years, was crumbling under the weight of accountability. But reforms on paper weren't enough. Walter knew it, Gloria knew it, and the city knew it. Change, real change, would only come when the culture within those walls shifted. And that work was only beginning. As the reforms were announced, the city held a town hall meeting at the largest auditorium in Savannah. Every seat was filled, and still people stood in the aisles and lined the back wall. Cameras broadcast the event live across the country. On stage, elected officials, federal agents, and reform advocates spoke one by one, but the final speaker was the one the crowd waited for. Gloria stepped onto the stage, wearing the same quiet dignity that had carried her through the darkest moments. She took her place at the podium and let the silence stretch, her eyes scanning the faces before her. These were not strangers. These were neighbors, co-workers, patients she had cared for, and strangers who had stood by her side when the world tried to tear her down. Her voice, when it came, was calm but unshakable. "Justice," she began, "is not a gift given by those in power. It is a demand, spoken every single day by those who refuse to be silent." The room was still, hanging on every word. Gloria's voice filled the auditorium with a calm certainty that silenced every whisper, every rustling paper, every stray thought. "This isn't the end," she said, letting the words hang in the air. "We did not come this far to stop at a courtroom verdict. We did not fight for accountability just to return to silence. Justice must be defended every day by every one of us." Her gaze swept the room, blocking eyes with students, elders, activists, and even some city officials who now sat with bowed heads. "The next generation is watching. What will we leave them?" A slow ripple of applause began at the back of the room, tentative at first, then swelling into a standing ovation that rolled forward like a wave. People stood, some wiping tears from their eyes, others raising their fists in quiet solidarity. The weight of the moment pressed on every heart. In the days ahead, policies would be rewritten, and officers would be retrained, but the true change was already alive in this room, in these people. That night, after the crowds dispersed and the cameras stopped rolling, Gloria and Walter returned to her modest home on the quiet street, where it had all begun. The sky was streaked with soft purples and oranges, the last light of the day fading behind the trees. They sat together on her porch, two warriors finally laying down their armor for the night. Walter leaned back in his chair, a rare, small smile crossing his face. "You spoke like your mother tonight," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of memory and pride. Gloria smiled, her heart aching and full at the same time. "She would have been here," she whispered, "in every way that mattered." They sat in peaceful silence, letting the cicadas fill the night air, letting the exhaustion of the fight slowly give way to the quiet dignity of victory. The work ahead was still vast. Savannah's wounds wouldn't heal overnight. Corruption would try to regroup. Power would resist change. But tonight, they had cracked something open that couldn't be sealed shut again. Gloria looked out over her porch, watching the neighborhood she had loved and served for decades. Somewhere nearby, children laughed and played in the fading light, their voices rising like a promise that the future could be brighter than the past. Walter glanced over, his voice low but certain. "The fight never really ends, Gloria. But sometimes we win a round." She nodded, the night breeze brushing against her face, carrying the scent of blooming jasmine. "Tonight, we won." And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe it. Not because the fight was over, but because they had shown the world it was worth waging in the first place. They sat there until the stars came out, quiet but unbroken, ready for whatever came next, because courage, once awakened, doesn't sleep easily, and neither of them ever would again.